Quantos minutos dava de diferença, tu lembra?
Tem isso.
Opa!
Começou. Tem um delayzinho só, mas...
Quase nada.
Deu certo?
Deu.
Vamos testar isso aqui.
Aqui.
Esse passador de slides, ele tá com problema? Tu sabe disso?
Eu acho que esse não funciona, mas eu tenho um em cima.
Tá.
Daí eu pego pra você. Eu acho que ele tá... Eu vou até levar um em cima pra ver. Já tá vendo meu presente no lugar. Esse tá funcionando.
Tá. Obrigado. Ele não está passando. Professor, this that doesn't work.
Okay,
Transmission,
that's fine.
But is in
That's fine.
tape line, okay?
That's fine. Yep.
Yeah. Nice.
Não, você apresenta aí. Essas duas horas.
Professor, you have we stay on time is in 2 minutes, but we'll wait.
How long do I have? How long is the workshop?
Oh, well, it's okay. It's the time you think okay.
Well, what is normal? How long do you normally go?
Around 1 hour.
Okay,
Okay.
1 hour is good. Yep.
Presentation, questions.
Yeah. Just checking. Different schools have different. We give our speakers exactly 1 hour and 20 minutes.
Okay.
Well, and mainly that's because that's how long our classes are.
Yeah.
So after an hour and 20 minutes, if we don't get out, the students start coming in, and because they've got their next class in 10 minutes. So
And you must get out.
we have to get out, otherwise the students will come in and what's going on?
Okay. Na transmissão ali. Pode sentar no fundo. Eu estou atendendo lá. Está fazendo. Não vai fechar isso. Não, você não assistiu. Ah, ok.
Our boss.
Pode começar. É só.
I will introduce you.
Okay, em português.
Okay, that's fine.
That's fine?
Yeah.
Ok. Boa tarde, pessoal. Obrigado por terem vindo aqui na nossa sessão. Nós estamos recebendo aqui o professor Wayne. O professor Wayne vem da Universidade da Pensilvânia, na Flórida. Ele está passando um tempo no Brasil, tá? E após a sua apresentação aqui em Florianópolis, ele tem a apresentação em São Paulo também. Ele está trazendo para nós esse paper em que ele trabalha sobre os determinantes do inside trading, tá? E é para nós assim um orgulho recebê-lo aqui, tá? A sua visita que está fazendo pelo Brasil, recebê-lo aqui no nosso programa de pós-graduação em contabilidade. Tá? Professor Wayne, it's a pleasure to be here with you in this moment at the PhD program, PhD and Master program in accounting. Here we have students from doctorate degree and PhD degree and master degree. It's a pleasure to be here and listen you about your paper. Feel free, you have an hour and an hour to explain questions about your paper. Okay. Feel free and welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. You ready to go? Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me visit. My wife is with me. This is our first time in Brazil. We came here to get away from the sun, and it seems like we've successfully done that. It doesn't seem like the sun is here. As was mentioned, I'm from the University of Pennsylvania, from the Wharton School of Business, where I've been for a long time, probably longer than many of you have been alive. So I've been there 27 years. This is a research. I appreciate you having me here to talk about my research. This is a paper that I'm writing with two former PhD students. So these were both my PhD students. It's very common at our business school and in our department to co-author papers with PhD students. And so Sean graduated last year. He's now at University of California, Berkeley, and David graduated about 6 years ago, and he's at USC. And this is a paper we've been working on for quite some time. We currently are in the second round review of management science, and so we're getting ready to make some changes and send it back there. So if you have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take them and talk about them. For some of you may be familiar with issues related to insider trading. Some of you may not be familiar with issues of insider trading. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the issue is here, what we're doing and why we're doing it. So within the U.S., and this would be true not just the U.S., but all over Europe and in other countries as well. I can't speak to South America, but certainly other countries outside of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, but certainly in the U.S., the vast majority, the majority of executives, senior executives in the United States, they receive most of their compensation in the form of stock. So people like myself get paid mainly in cash. So when I get my compensation each month, it's in cash. If you're an executive in the US or in Europe, 70 to 80% of your compensation comes in the form of stock. And so you can't feed your family and buy a house with stock. You at some point need to be able to sell that stock in order to get cash that then you can use to buy or to invest or to diversify. And so executives demand liquidity. Liquidity meaning that they need the opportunity to be able to sell stock. And if they're working for your company for 10 or 15 or 20 years, it's difficult to tell them, well, you can sell your stock when you leave the company in 20 years, because between now and then, they need to eat. They need to buy a house. They need to put their kids in college. They need to do different things. So executives are going to need to sell their stock. But as we can imagine, executives at companies are much better informed about the company than general investors in the stock market. So the danger is that these executives will choose to sell their stock when they know that the market is maybe overly optimistic or the stock price is too high. If I'm an executive and I know there's some bad news coming, I might have an incentive to sell my stock now before the stock price drops. And investors are concerned about that because they're the ones that are trading against these executives in the marketplace. The Security and Exchange Commission in the US, the SEC, the regulators don't like it when executives take advantage of investors in the marketplace. If investors in the marketplace think that they're at an informational disadvantage, they won't trade. Bid-ask spreads will be higher, liquidity in the market will be lower, and stock markets don't function very well. And so the SEC has an interest in trying to make sure that, yes, executives get to sell their stock, but that they don't sell their stock when they're in a position of informational advantage. So in the US, executives, like any other investor, are not allowed to sell their stock while they're in possession of what's called material non-public information. So material non-public information, they're not supposed to sell the stock. Okay? Now, so it's a balance here. If we put too many constraints on executives, if we make it too hard for them to sell their stock, they're not going to accept stock as a form of compensation, and the incentives that are provided to the executives from holding stock won't be there. And in my opinion, this is something I've studied for many, many years, one of the strongest drivers of corporations and economies in general is when managers have incentives to drive their companies forward, to increase profits, to be successful. And so we want executives to have their incentives tied to the stock price. If you put too many constraints on them, they won't want to accept this type of compensation. If you put too few constraints on them, they may abuse their position and trade when they have private information, which is a problem. So regulators like the SEC are well known to try to police the insider trading. They do it through litigation, they do it through fines, they do it through other sorts of things. But public companies also recognize that when their CEO gets put in jail by the SEC for trading on non-public information, that's not good for the company, right? That's a public relations nightmare. And so public companies proactively take actions to try to reduce the ability of their executives to trade on private information. And so the SEC monitors from above, firms do their own monitoring within the organization. And so firms adopt policies that put restrictions on the ability of executives to sell stock. But we know very little about these policies. And the reason we know very little about these policies is because the disclosure of these policies is voluntary. And most companies, the vast majority of companies, choose not to disclose those policies. And so investors know that the company has a policy, but they don't know what that policy is. The SEC didn't like that, and so starting this year, these policies will become mandatory or required disclosures. So companies are going to have to start disclosing these policies. And so we'll get a lot more information, and I would expect to see research papers over the next few years that take advantage of this new data when it becomes available. Okay, so for those of you that aren't familiar with what these policies say or how they work, these insider trading policies that companies have, they specify a number of things. They'll talk about the types of individuals that are covered by the policy. Does it cover all employees? Does it cover just the senior executives? When an executive trades, are they required to go to the general counsel's office, the compliance office, and get pre-approval? Okay, so in the same way that if you have you're going to a conference and you need to get expenses approved, you might have to get things pre-approved. Most companies require the general counsel's office to pre-approve insider trades. Are there certain types of trades that are prohibited? So there have been a number of high-profile cases where executives have, for example, they've pledged their company stock as a form of collateral to take out private loans. Okay, so Elon Musk, a person you might be familiar with, the CEO of Tesla, Elon Musk has a special clause in his employment contract that allows him to use, I think, up to 10 or 20% of his stock as collateral to take out personal loans that then he can go invest in his other projects. But there have been cases, CEOs, for example, that have pledged all of their company stock as collateral for private loans. When the stock price drops, that collateral is no longer sufficient for the loan. The lender then asks for more collateral, and the only way the executive can get more collateral is to sell off that stock and pay off the loan. So there have been a number of high-profile cases where CEOs have had to sell all of their company stock instantly in order to put up more collateral for a loan. And that's a public relations problem. Imagine having to tell your investors that the CEO sold all of his stock in the company yesterday. Okay, so that's a problem. So many companies prohibit these kinds of transactions. They prohibit hedge derivatives transactions and other sorts of things. Now, these are the ones that are more specific to the paper that I'm going to talk about today. These policies put forward quarterly allowed trading windows. So they tell executives that when they can and can't trade in a given quarter. So as we all know, at least in the US, firms are required to file quarterly financial statements every quarter. Right, so a firm with a December fiscal year end, they have to file a March 31st 10Q, a June 30th 10Q, and so on. And so what most companies do is they'll say that executives are not allowed to trade stock in the period leading up to an earnings announcement. So in the period leading up to the earnings announcement, the executives are likely to have some private information that investors don't have. So in the weeks leading up to an earnings announcement, the policies prohibit executives from selling stock. And most of these policies will then say, okay, 1 day or 2 days or 5 days after the earnings announcement, you can start selling. So once the earnings are announced, you have to wait a certain number of days, then you can start selling. You're allowed to keep selling for some number of weeks until you get closer to the end of the fiscal quarter, and then you have to stop trading. So these companies tell their executives, here's the window during a normal quarter where you're allowed to trade, and here's the window during a normal quarter when you're not allowed to trade. But when you look across firms, those policies vary quite a bit. So for some companies, they say that the executives can start trading 1 day after the earnings announcement. For other companies, it's 3 days or 5 days or 7 days. For some companies, they say that executives can trade right up to the end of the fiscal quarter. For other companies, it might be 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks before the end of the fiscal quarter. And what we're going to try to do in this paper is understand those choices. What are the factors that companies are considering when deciding how strict or loose to be with respect to insider trading? So that's kind of one of the keys. The other thing we're going to look at in the paper are what we call ad hoc blackout windows. Now, these are kind of interesting because what companies will also do is they'll say, okay, during a normal quarter, information about sales and productivity builds over the quarter. Then you announce earnings, and that information is revealed. But there are sort of unusual events or special events that might put executives in a position where they have non-public information. For example, if I'm a company that's in negotiations with another company that wants to acquire me, right? So another company's thinking about acquiring me. I'm a takeover target. You could imagine that those executives have private information about something important. Or if one of your biggest customers is about to leave because they're going to a competitor, or you're about to fire your CEO because the CEO hasn't been doing a good job. Maybe the CEO is involved with some sort of misconduct and you're about to fire the CEO. Those would be the types of events where you wouldn't want your executives trading in advance of that information, because then the SEC will come, then investors will say, hey, why is this guy trading his stock when something just, there was just an announcement that you're about to be taken over. You just fired your CEO, and I've observed that your CEO has been selling stock in the period leading up to that. Another thing to keep in mind is that in the US, when an executive sells stock or buys stock, they have to make a public disclosure of that purchase or sale within 48 hours, within 2 days. So they have 2 days to tell the SEC that they've traded. So the trading is not private. You have to publicly disclose to investors every time you buy or sell stock within 2 days. Okay, so that's another thing to think about. So we're going to try to understand what kinds of events that companies stop their executives from trading. Okay, so we're going to look at those two things. So these insider trading policies protect firms from legal and reputational risks. But as I noted a minute ago, because disclosure of these plans is optional and very few firms provide public disclosure, we really know very little about what companies have done. So that's what we're going to try to study here. Okay, so to summarize what we found in the paper, and then I'll get into some of the details, what we're trying to do is to understand how quickly firms allow their executives to trade after an earnings announcement and how long they then allow them to trade before they close down that window again. And in general, we find that these trading restrictions seem to be related to informational problems or information asymmetry in the market. So for some companies, there tends to be bigger informational problems with investors. So investors are more uncertain about what's going on at the firm. It's harder for the firm to convey information about what's going on. Information might build up more quickly during the quarter. So these informational problems we find are very influential in determining how wide or narrow that trading window is. So for firms that have informational problems, they tend to make a shorter window. For firms where investors have better information and where information is more quickly impounded into prices, they tend to allow their executives a longer trading window because they're less worried about the executives taking advantage of information. We find some evidence that these restrictions reflect insiders' demand for liquidity. So if I'm a CEO that gets 90% of my compensation in stock, I might want greater ability to trade than a CEO that only gets 50% of their compensation in the form of stock. So the more stock you provide to your employees, the more you're going to flexibility you need to give them with respect to trading, and that's what we find. We also find some evidence that these windows are a function of litigation risk, because in the U.S., companies get, one of the big litigation issues for a public company in the U.S. is that if investors are able to provide evidence that firms knew important information and didn't disclose it. So, for example, if you told investors that, hey, everything's going great, we expect our earnings to increase by 20% per year over the next few quarters. We're selling we've got lots of new products, we've got lots of new customers, and then over the next 6 months or a year, if that information is no longer correct, if your customers aren't coming, if your products aren't coming, if you're a pharmaceutical company and you have a new drug that didn't pass certain tests or what have you, you have a requirement to disclose that information so that investors aren't continuing to believe that things are going well when they're not going well. And so litigation can pop in the U.S. when executives aren't forthcoming with that information. And so to firms that believe that there's a greater likelihood of being litigated against, they tend to be more strict with these windows. With respect to these ad hoc blackout windows, we find that they predict certain types of firm-specific events like mergers and acquisitions, but that they don't predict other types of events, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. We also find that investors don't appear to fully understand what it means when they don't see executives trading. So with these ad hoc blackout windows, what investors will observe are weeks going by, maybe quarters going by with no executives trading. Okay, so if you see executives trading a lot, that could provide some information to you as an investor. If you see that executives aren't trading at all, that can also provide information, right? If you've got a company where executives tend to trade 10 or 20 times in a quarter, and suddenly you see 2 or 3 quarters with no trading, that should also be informative to investors. They should say, what's going on? Why aren't these executives trading? They normally trade. They haven't traded in 6 months. What's up? What am I missing? And so we find that investors don't appear to fully anticipate these events because we find some abnormal returns in the future related to these ad hoc blackout windows. Okay, let me get into what we've done. So just to give you an example of what these insider trading policies look like. So as I noted, disclosure is voluntary, and very few firms do disclose, but some do, a few do. So this is Adobe that you might be familiar with, the PDFs, the PDFs that you have. They're the guys that have that software. So they have an insider trading policy that's publicly disclosed. And this is just some excerpts from the text. It says the trading window opens each quarter at the start of the first trading day that's at least 24 hours following the date of public disclosure of financial results. So basically, once one full day has passed after the earnings are announced, executives can start to trade. The trading window then closes 4 weeks prior to the end of the quarter. So if you're a December fiscal year firm, your first quarter ends on March 31st, the trading window closes 4 weeks before March 31st. So leading up to that period, you're not allowed to trade. So if you work out the numbers here, this allowed trading window, the window where they're allowed to trade, is about 32 days. Okay, so that's the number of days for Adobe. They also note that there can be ad hoc blackout windows, special trading restrictions. From time to time, an event may occur that's material to Adobe and is known only by a few directors, officers, or employees. So long as the event remains material and non-public, the persons designed by the trading compliance officer may not trade securities. So they say that from time to time, we might just tell everybody no trading. And we may not even tell you why you can't trade, right? If the firm is involved in negotiations over a merger, right, it may just be a handful of executives that know about that. They're not going to spread that information to the whole organization because then it's going to leak out to the public. So you might be an executive and you get an email from the general counsel's office that says, no trading until further notice. You say, but why? I'm not going to tell you why. You're not entitled to know why. Okay. Here's another company called Shake Shack. This is a big restaurant chain company in the U.S. They also disclose their policy. And just to give you some sense for the differences, so here the trading window closed 4 weeks before the end of the quarter. And so the open trading window was 32 days. Shake Shack has a very similar set of policy, except that they close their window 14 days, 2 weeks before the end of the quarter instead of 4 weeks. So this company has a much longer trading window because they allow the executives to trade an extra 2 weeks. And so their window is much longer than Adobe's is. And what we're going to try to do in this paper is understand why. Why would Shake Shack allow a longer window and Adobe a shorter window? Just to give you some idea of how much this varies across firms. So this is from a survey that was done by Deloitte, the big accounting firm. They also have a big consulting arm in 2020. This was a survey they did of companies, public companies. And so they asked them, how soon do you allow your employees to trade after the earnings announcement? And then when does your open trading window end? Okay. And for roughly 34% of the companies, 1 day after the earnings announcement, 49% 2 days, and then 17% more than 2 days. At the end of the quarter, we see even more variation. So we have some 28% that close down the window 25 days or more before the end of the quarter. We have, say, 32% of the firms that close down the window 11 to 15 days. We've got 4% of the firms that close the window right at the end of the quarter. And interestingly, about 6% of the firms that even allow the executives to trade after the quarter ends. So even once the executives have a pretty good idea of how the company did that quarter, they still allow trading to continue. So you can see there's a lot of variation in these windows. And what we're going to try to understand is why. What are the forces, the economic forces that are influencing these decisions? So that's what we're going to do. That's what we're trying to figure out. Okay, so the tricky part here is because these trading policies are voluntarily disclosed, we don't have data on what these policies look like. And even once companies do disclose them, we still would be a little concerned about, how strictly do the companies enforce these policies? Just because they have a policy that says this, are they actually enforcing that policy? And so because we can't observe the policies yet, what we're going to try to do is to estimate these trading windows based on observed trading data. So we can actually go collect all of the trades made by executives of every public company in the US. You can see the exact day of the trade. And so conceptually, what we're going to do here is we're going to get all of those trades. Let's say we have for each company, we have 50 trades each quarter for every company. Let's say it's not that high, but let's say 50 trades for each company in a quarter. And let's say for one company, we observe that, boy, the executives never seem to trade until at least 3 days after the earnings announcement. Okay, for the other company, sometimes they trade 3 days after the earnings announcement, but sometimes they trade 1 day after the earnings announcement or 2 days after the earnings announcement. So we're going to look at that data and we're going to say, okay, for the company where we see trades 1 day after the earnings announcement, we're going to assume that the policy allows trading 1 day after the earnings announcement. And for another company, if we never see any trades until 3 days after the earnings announcement, we're going to assume that that company has a 3-day requirement. And similarly, toward the end of the quarter, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the trades at the end of the quarter, and we're going to say if most of the trades stop 2 weeks before the end of the quarter consistently, we're going to assume that that's when the trading window ends. If most of the trades stop right at the end of the quarter, or 4 weeks before the end of the quarter, we're going to assume that that company has a shorter or longer trading window. So we're going to use the distribution of trades as a proxy for what that insider trading policy is, because we don't have the policies. So that's kind of the trick, okay? And the rest of this is just sort of some of the details of how we do this. So we go get all the data that's publicly disclosed. We try to filter out certain types of trades. So this has become a hot topic in the US over the last year or two. The SEC allows executives to put in place trading plans. So historically, if we went back 20 years, if an executive wanted to sell stock, they just called up a stockbroker and said, I want to trade some stock. And the next day the stock would get traded. And you can still do that. But about 20 years ago, the SEC said, that there's a lot of lawsuits that happen over insider trading. Most executives want to trade their stock in a way where they're not trying to take advantage of information. Let's allow companies to put in place trading plans where the executive can say, I'm going to make a decision to trade today, but I'm not going to trade for another 60 days. I'm not going to trade for another 90 days. Okay, so if you can imagine that the issue here, so if I know some private information, let's say I know that something good or bad is going to happen in my company over the next several weeks. If I trade today, right, and the information comes out in a week or two, you're going to think that I use that information in making my trade. But if I put a plan in place, if I sign on a plan where the trade's not going to happen for 90 days, we're much less concerned that the executive traded on information, because anything they know today, the chances of it still being private information, 60, 90, 120 days down, is much less likely. And so what these plans allowed is they allowed executives to put in a trading plan to make it less likely that they were trading on private information and to make it harder for litigation to occur. So when they trade and they say, hey, no, I didn't just trade today. I put that plan in place 3 months ago or 4 months ago. Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, you're probably familiar with Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, he has a plan in place to trade every day. So he puts a plan in, I don't know when he put it in, a long time ago. He put a plan in place and he says, I'm going to trade X number of shares or X percent of my portfolio every day forever. So every trading day, Mark Zuckerberg trades. He trades a small amount of shares, but he trades every day. It becomes really hard to look at his trades and say that he's trading on private information, because he trades every day. He trades on a Monday, he trades on Tuesday, he trades on Wednesday, he trades on Thursday and Friday, and he does the same thing next week, and he does the same. So when executives can put their trades into a pattern or put plans in place to say, I'm going to trade in 3 months, I'm going to trade in 6 months, it becomes much harder to accuse them of trading on information. So that's what these plans tended to do. So, but the problem is that if I see a trade today, I don't know if that trade was, if the executive chose to trade today or they chose to trade 2 months ago or 3 months ago. So the problem there is I can observe a trade that's the day before an earnings announcement. And you might say, well, how can an executive trade a day before an earnings announcement? That sounds like they're trading on information. But if they put that trade in place 3 months ago, then it's not a problem to trade a day before an earnings announcement. So these 10b5-1 trades make it more difficult for us to estimate these trading windows. So we try to strip those out of the sample. We're going to look at data from 2012 to 2020. I'm going to skip over this. This is just how executives report their trades. That's where we get our data. And so essentially what we're going to try to do, and this is a little bit of a timeline. So if this is when the quarter ends, and this is when the earnings gets announced, we're going to measure how many days does a company require the executive to wait before they allow the trade. And then relative to the end of the quarter, how many days before the end of the quarter do they stop executives from trading? So we're going to count these days and we're going to count these days. And the important thing to just keep in mind is that those measures are increasing with the restrictiveness of the trading window. So the longer I make you wait, the more restrictive the plan is. The greater the number of days before the end of the quarter where I shut you down from trading, the more restrictive it is. So both of these measures are going to be increasing with strictness. Okay. All right. We're going to require a minimum of 10 trades during a given quarter. We're going to aggregate these trades over an 8-quarter period. So we're going to look at trades over an 8-quarter period. And we're going to say, okay, when's the first day we saw trades for those guys over that 8-quarter period? Okay, if it was 2 days after the earnings announcement, you're a 2-day firm. And when do we see the trade stop during the quarter over that 8-quarter period? And that's how we're going to estimate these windows. So that's the idea. Okay. All right. Skip that. So this is the empirical distribution that we find. So in terms of when the windows start, we find that the typical firm allows trading to begin either 1 or 2 days after the earnings announcement, but you do see some variation. And then in terms of how far before the end of the window they close it down, 20 days before the end of the quarter is roughly the median and the mean. And you can see that our empirical distribution here is not too far from this. Okay, so the typical firm here requires 2 days before they can start trading, and some 1 day. The typical firm here shuts down the window about 2 weeks before the end of the quarter. And if we look at what now these guys are they're surveying a couple hundred firms. We're looking at a few thousand firms. And based on these thousands of firms, we're getting a distribution that's not that different from what Deloitte got in their survey data. We also go out and hand collect insider trading policies for about 60 firms that voluntarily disclose those policies. And we estimate their trading, we estimate their insider trading window. We look at what the disclosures tell us for these 60 firms just to see how highly correlated they are. And we find a correlation of about 0.6 between what they disclosed and what we empirically estimate. Okay, so we kind of feel like, look, it's not perfect, but we're capturing, some reasonable information about these trading windows. Okay. So we have a number of different hypotheses that we're going to test. So we're going to try to make some predictions here about which firms will have a looser or a tighter insider trading window. The first one is the one I started out with at the beginning of my talk, concerns about information asymmetry. So for firms where the information environment is not as rich, where there are more informational problems, we're going to predict that they have a tighter trading window. They're more concerned with executives taking advantage of information because they're a firm where information asymmetry tends to be greater. So these would be firms with higher bid-ask spreads, firms where prices move a lot during the earnings announcement. So if you're a firm where price doesn't move very much when you announce earnings, that's probably because the information environment is more transparent leading up to the earnings announcement. Right? If you're a firm where the price doesn't move at all leading up to the earnings announcement, and then when you release earnings, prices move a lot, well, that's a firm where information is probably building up over the course of the quarter, where you might be concerned with executives trading on information. So that's the kind of thing we're going to estimate there. We're also predicting that external monitoring can be an important determinant of these insider trading windows. So if you have a lot of analysts, institutional investors, the media, the financial press, if you've got a lot of people watching your company, think about Apple, Tesla, Microsoft, Facebook, right? Those are companies with a lot of scrutiny, tons of analysts, tons of news reporters, tons of institutional investors. They're watching every little thing that you do, right? So if you've got people that are really focused on your firm, they might sort of demand that you have stricter policies with respect to insider trading, or they might be a substitute. You might not be as concerned about your executives trading on information, because if they do, you're almost sure that an analyst, the media, somebody is going to point that out. And so the management team could naturally just behave themselves because they know that if they take 1 foot out of place, people are going to be on it. So this could go either way. So this monitoring intensity could lead to more strict or less strict trading windows, depending on how those forces work out. When employees have greater liquidity needs, so if you're providing more of the compensation to your executives in the form of stock, they might need more freedom to trade. If you've got a firm where there's lots of insider trades in a given quarter, they might need more flexibility. So we look at those determinants, and then litigation risk. So if you're a firm that's likely to attract more litigation, then you're going to be more concerned about your executives trading on information because you're more likely to get sued. And here I think the biggest determinant in my mind is firm size. So I do a fair bit of expert testimony, so litigation consulting, and a huge determinant of whether a company is going to get sued is how much money the lawyers and the plaintiff can get from that lawsuit. So trying to sue a small company, I mean, even if you can argue that there was a 30% change in the stock price, that investors traded on that inappropriately, a 30% change in stock price for a $20 million company is going to be much less interesting to lawyers than a 1% change in the stock price for a $100 billion company. So big companies attract more litigation because the payouts to the lawyers are going to be great. So litigation risk, we look at that as well. Okay, what do we find in terms of results? We find fairly consistent results that the information asymmetry effects are there. So again, the dependent variable here is increasing with the strictness of the window. So the window end is how many days before the end of the quarter we shut down trading. So firms with bigger spreads, so where there's bigger bid-ask spreads, they tend to be more restrictive. They close down the window sooner. Firms where the earnings announcement resolves more of the information, more of the price effect, they tend to be more strict as well. Bigger firms with greater analyst following, they tend to be more strict as well. So the institutional investors, when you know you've got the press covering you, when you know you've got analysts covering you, they tend to put tighter constraints on trading, probably because they don't want to attract that kind of attention. We find that liquidity needs also seem to be somewhat influential. When the CEO, for example, owns more equity and may need to do more trading, we find that the window is looser to allow the window to keep going further in the quarter. We find that for firms where there's lots of insiders that trade during a quarter, we find them also have looser windows to give those employees that kind of liquidity. In terms of litigation risk, we find some mixed results, but we do find that big firms have stricter policies, which I think is probably the strongest predictor of litigation risk, and that more profitable companies, at least in terms of return on assets, they tend to have stricter windows as well. And so those firms, big profitable companies, are going to attract more litigation, and so they tend to be stricter with their insider trading. Okay, any questions on that? So in terms of, so that was what determines the end of the trading window. The start of the trading window is kind of a similar story. So if I'm trying to figure out how long executives should wait after the earnings announcement to trade, as you might imagine, the biggest concern would be how quickly does that earnings announcement get impounded in the price, right? So if I make an earnings announcement today, is the market for my shares liquid enough that that information is going to get impounded in an hour, 2 hours, 5 hours? If so, then maybe I allow the executives to start trading tomorrow. If I'm a company that's not very heavily followed by analysts, a company that doesn't have a lot of institutional holdings or institutional investors, maybe it takes a couple of days before that earnings announcement gets impounded into prices. And so you might make your executives wait 2 or 3 or 4 days. So that's what we're going to try to test here. We're going to try to look at things like trading volume, bid-ask spreads, how the bid-ask spread changes around the earnings announcement. So we know from the literature that bid-ask spreads increase leading up to the earnings announcement, and then they shrink after the earnings announcement. How big a change is that, and how quickly does it happen? So that's kind of what we're going to test here. In terms of empirical evidence, we find pretty strong evidence of those predictions. So these are our predicted signs. So we find, for example, that firms with more trading volume, where there's more trading volume, they tend to be less restricted. So they tend to allow their executives to trade more quickly because information is getting impounded into price. For firms where the effective spread or the change where the effective spread is greater, we find that, again, they allow the window, they essentially, when the earnings announcement spread is higher, we find that they require executives to wait a little bit longer before trading. So that's kind of the meat of that. So essentially we find, and this, if you were to listen to the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, if you were to listen to some of the popular press, you would probably get the impression that companies don't care about insider trading issues. The companies let their executives trade whenever they want, or that executives simply trade whenever they want without any restrictions. And the only thing that's going to stop them from trading on information is litigation or the SEC. What we find in this paper is that doesn't seem to be right, that firms do have these insider trading policies. They do seem to be selecting the looseness or strictness of the policy based on economic determinants of how information gets impounded in prices. And as accountants, one of the things that we study is how does information get reflected in the stock market? That's one of the big questions. And we find here that the firms and the boards do seem to be considering how quickly information gets impounded in prices when setting these insider trading policies. Now, in spite of that, one of the things we do look at, just to sort of see what we might find, is, although it seems like companies are thoughtfully thinking about these policies, I'm sure there are companies that aren't giving it as much thought as others. And so one of the things we asked is, well, we now have some sense for what firms seem to be thinking about when setting these policies. What happens if a company that the determinants model suggests should have a strict window actually has a loose window, right? Now that we know the determinants of these windows, we can go look for companies where their underlying economic characteristics suggest they should have a pretty strict window. But when we actually look at executive trading, they have a loose window, right? So those might be firms that are not paying as close attention to this as they should. They should be strict with insider trading. They're not. Do executives take advantage of that? And we find exactly that, okay? So what we do is we look for firms that our regression model suggests should be strict, and we look for ones that are unusually loose. And then we go look to see whether executives earn abnormal returns on their trades. And in fact, we find that the trading profits for executives that trade late in the quarter and later than what we would predict they should be allowed to trade, do they generate more abnormal returns? And in fact, we find that they generate significantly greater returns on their trades. So, greater returns on their trades if the firm has a policy that looks like it's too loose. Okay, so that's kind of what we do there. Okay, I've just got about 10 more minutes. I want to talk a little bit about this other part of the paper because I think it's kind of interesting. And so this is the idea that, or the notion that what we did up to this point in the paper, this stuff was all sort of during a normal quarter. Okay, during a normal quarter, you release earnings. Then there's some weeks that go by, and then eventually the quarter ends. You release earnings again. So in a normal cycle, when does the firm allow executives to trade, and when do they stop them from trading? What we also look at is what happens when it's not a normal quarter. What happens when it's a quarter where you've got some material event? You're about to default on one of your bonds or some of your debt, or again, you're about to fire your CEO. There's some scandal that you need to tell investors, but you've been dragging your feet a little bit, right? In those cases, the general counsel's office might shut down trading. They might say, okay, there's some information that might come out to investors. We're going to shut down trading. And so they'll send out a memo. Nobody can trade until further notice, okay? And so, so these ad hoc blackout periods get imposed on some firms. If you don't impose that ad hoc blackout period, you can be subject to greater litigation risk. Okay. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look for quarters that have an unusually small number of trades. Okay. So if you're a company where in a normal quarter, there's 15 trades by insiders, right? Normal quarter, 15 trades, normal quarter, 15 trades, normal quarter, 15 trades. Then we see one with 2 trades, or we see one with no trades. We don't know for sure, but a good guess might be that that's a quarter where the executives were prohibited from trading. Okay? And we control for recent stock returns, because one possible reason why you might not see any trades is if the stock price drops and the stock price is very low, and executives have stock options that are out of the money, underwater options, then you might not see any trades. So if we look at your normal amount of trading, controlling for stock returns, and we look for sort of periods where there are no trades. And this is kind of analogous to another accounting literature that looks at quarters where there aren't any disclosures. Okay, so that a typical firm might make 2 or 3 or 4 public announcements in a given quarter, maybe more than that, press releases. Company might be releasing information all the time. And then if we see a quarter where Apple doesn't make any press releases at all, you sort of say, hey, what's going on there? Apple usually makes a half a dozen press releases in a quarter. If we don't see any press releases, there's something going on there. This would be the same thing with insider trading. When we don't see any trading, what's going on? And we find that these periods with very few trades, they do predict 8K disclosures. So as you probably know, the 8Ks are how in the US companies disclose material events. Okay, and there's different types of 8Ks. They each have a different number on them. And we find that in general, these blackout windows or these ad hoc blackout periods predict future 8Ks, but specifically certain types of 8Ks. So material agreements like bankruptcy, if the company's getting ready to file for bankruptcy or there's bankruptcy or default issues, that seems to be one of the things that's predicted. Mergers and acquisitions seem to be predicted. Governance and management changes, so hiring a new CEO, firing a CEO. Those are the types of 8Ks that these ad hoc blackout periods significantly predict. Interestingly, at least for accountants, there's no evidence that these ad hoc blackout periods predict Section 4 8Ks, which are accounting issues. So if you have a material weakness, for example, if the auditor decides that you have a material weakness and you're getting ready to disclose that to investors, we as accountants think about those audit issues as being really important, right? You didn't get a clean audit opinion. You've got some material weaknesses, some internal control problems. We think those are really important. The general counsel's office doesn't think they're very important, or at least that's what our evidence suggests. So even when there are material weaknesses, they allow the executives to trade, okay? For better or for worse, they don't seem to think accounting issues are very important. We find that investors seem to be somewhat sophisticated here. So we would normally think, you'd normally think in a market that if you knew you were trading with informed investors, that bid-ask spreads would increase, right? If we think there's a lot of informed investors in the market, the market maker is going to increase the bid-ask spreads, right? What we find here is that in an ad hoc blackout window, when there's almost no trading, spreads also increase, right? So this is a quarter where no insiders are trading, and investors are smart enough to know that seems kind of weird. If they're not trading at all, right? If insiders were trading like crazy, you might say they know something we don't know. If insiders aren't trading at all, they also think somebody knows something that we don't know, and so spreads go up. In the quarter after this ad hoc blackout window, spreads fall again. Similarly, during one of these ad hoc blackout periods, trading volume goes down. So typically we might think that, if a lot of people are trading, if there's a lot of informed investors in the market, trading volume is going to drop because the liquidity traders don't want to get involved. But trading volume also drops when there's no trading by insiders in the market. So investors seem pretty sophisticated with respect to these ad hoc blackout periods, though not completely sophisticated, because when we look at these ad hoc blackout periods and what kind of returns they generate, we find that on average, these ad hoc blackout periods are bad news. For investors, view them as bad news. And keep in mind, when an investor sees no trading, they don't know whether it's because of a bankruptcy that's coming up, or because they're about to be acquired, or because the CEO is about to be fired, right? Could be any of those things, right? You see a firm that's not doing very well, they're struggling, nobody's trading, well, maybe they're about to go bankrupt. Or maybe some other company is going to come in and throw them a lifeline and acquire them. Or maybe the CEO is going to get fired and we're going to get a better CEO. Investors just see it's no trading. They don't know why, right? They don't know why. So we don't know for sure whether on average these blackout windows are good or bad news. We find that on average they seem to be bad news, but somewhat interestingly, when we look 1 quarter, 1 year ahead, if you were to come up with a trading strategy and essentially buy companies where there's no trading, with an unusually low amount of trading, you'd make about 1% of normal returns over the next year. So we find some evidence that investors don't fully price the effect of these ad hoc blackout periods. And we haven't fully explored this yet. And we're also thinking we might just carve this out of the paper and do something separate with it. That's at least what the referees in management science are suggesting that we do. But I think both analyses are kind of interesting. Okay, I think I'm out of time. And So this is just a little bit more empirical evidence on those abnormal returns. We find that in general, those abnormal returns are greater for firms that are smaller, growth firms, higher cash liquidity. So we find some evidence that investors seem to think about some of the issues related to what these 8Ks might be. And that's what I have. So conclusion is that these companies are thinking about these issues. These companies are not just allowing their executives to trade whenever they want to. They do seem to be concerned about market liquidity. They seem to be concerned about investors' issues. They seem to be concerned about information asymmetry, but at the same time recognizing that because they're paying their executives mainly with stock, they also have to allow them the liquidity to be able to cash that stock in. So that's what I've got. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you having me here at the university.
Some questions?
Any questions?
Any questions?
I don't bite.
Professor não morde, pode perguntar em português.
Is anybody? What's
I
that?
have a question
Yes.
about the market of compensation of executives.
Mm-hmm.
I think in Brazil you don't have so many compensation in stocks. Because you have so much information about this. You said the CEO can sell your stock. They inform 2 days to inform the SIC.
Yeah. So so if I want to buy, if I buy or sell stock,
Yeah.
I need to tell the SEC. I need to file one of the form that I had here. It looks just like this.
Yeah.
I have to file this form within 2 days, within 2 business days. So this is an executive, I guess, Catherine Adams from, she's at Apple. She filed this form on February 1st, 2021, and she has to disclose what day she traded, how many shares she traded, what price she traded at, and then how much stock she still holds. So they have to do that within 2 days. Now, not every executive, this is required of what's called Section 16 filers. So within a company, the company will designate certain executives as being high enough level that they have to do this. So within Apple, maybe there's 20 executives that have to do this, or 25 executives. Not everybody in the company,
Okay.
just the 20 most senior executives that have control. So, yeah. And you're saying in Brazil, they don't pay in stock, and why do you think that is? They don't pay as much stock?
Let's ask the audience.
Let's ask the audience.
Pessoal, o professor estava perguntando, vocês têm estudado sistema de compensação de executivos, algum de vocês?
Eu já.
Você já? Ele estava perguntando, porque nos Estados Unidos, está dizendo que o executivo tem que informar em 2 dias a venda de ações. Isso gera uma base de dados. Consegue fazer uma pesquisa como essa. Certo? E ele estava questionando como no Brasil é feita essa informação.
Porque a gente não tem nem a remuneração do CEO, né?
Nós não temos a
Não,
informação.
a gente tem a remuneração da diretoria, do conselho. Você não tem
Por
informação
indivíduo.
individual.
Por
Por indivíduo, não.
Yeah.
A gente
You
tem
you don't have information about compensation plans by individuals, just by the board.
Just by the
Only
board.
amount of the board, you get information is
We don't have by individuals.
yeah, because this we call it in lunch about the security, the unsafe report.
I'm not sure I believe that. I mean, in the U.S., if you're a CEO of a big company in the U.S., just about every CEO has a ton of security protection. The company pays for them. They've got walls around their house. They've got a private jet. They've got a security detail. I mean, if you're running a $100 billion company, they should be able to perform, if they need a bodyguard around the CEO, I mean, maybe that's what it is, but I mean, and also if I know you're running a big company, I don't have to see the disclosures to know you're rich, right? So, I mean, if I see that you're making 10 million versus 20 million, if I'm going to rob you, I don't think that makes a big difference. I wouldn't think.
Ok. Em português. O professor ele estava comentando na hora do almoço e ele achou muito estranho no mercado brasileiro não termos a informação em termos de confiança dos investidores das empresas. Porque se os investidores conhecem o plano de remuneração dos acionistas, ele coloca isso como um ponto-chave para a decisão do investidor, a confiança que ele tem na empresa. Então, ele estava colocando essa questão, ele acha muito curioso, nós não temos esse tipo de informação. Na Europa e nos Estados Unidos, nos últimos 20 anos, aumentou o disclosure de informação. Mas nós temos aqui, our students.
Algumas empresas informam a remuneração variável, né? Qual que é o percentual com base no resultado da empresa e qual que é o percentual em ações.
Por diretor?
Não
Por
diretor.
também.
Sempre o board.
Sempre o board.
Okay. That's our counter, no?
What's that?
That's our policy. We don't disclose it. We do not disclose the compensation plans. Just some information. Just some information about the board compensation plan.
So, okay, but so they might be getting paid in stock. You just don't know. They might, the executives might be receiving most of their compensation in stock, but you just don't know. It's just not information. See, I would think you could do, I mean, even if it's not disclosed, I mean, like surveys, right? Like the, I would think there'd be surveys out there on the compensation that, so like, on this survey, I mean, Deloitte doesn't disclose names,
Okay.
right? We don't know who these firms are.
Okay.
So I would think that, I don't know, I would think people, investors, somebody in Brazil would have tried to survey to figure out what's going on at these companies or how
Okay.
common things are, or
Vocês conhecem algum estudo, como o da Deloitte, ou algum estudo que tenha feito isso? We don't know.
we don't know. I'm curious. I mean, because it's, I mean, and I was talking at lunch, but 20 years ago, I mean, there were certain countries like the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, they provided good disclosures, but many countries in the world, in Europe, for example, did not provide good disclosures of compensation, in Asia and other places. And that's changed a lot in the last 20 years. So almost, just about everywhere in every EU country provides detailed compensation, even to the point where throughout the EU, the US, Canada, UK, not only do companies have to disclose the compensation, but shareholders are required to vote on that compensation plan every year. So every year in the EU, companies disclose the compensation plan for the senior managers to shareholders. Shareholders then vote on whether they approve or don't approve that compensation plan. And they do that every year. In the US, there's a requirement that shareholders have to vote on the compensation plan as well. And that was put in place after the financial crisis in 2009, 2010, because there were a lot of concerns that the executives' compensation plans were in part responsible for that crisis. And so after that crisis, the US and a bunch of other countries put in place mandatory shareholder voting on the compensation plans to get shareholders' approval of how the companies were being managed.
Before the discussion, I was going to ask what's the most difficult part of this paper to do, because in Brazil I think that's impossible.
Well, you don't have the data. Yeah, you don't have the data. You could do this paper in many countries. So we used US data, but you could do it in Europe. So most of the European countries provide this information. The UK, Canada. The hardest part, I mean, fortunately for me, I have 2 former doctoral students. So they did most of the work, the heavy lifting, but it really was a lot of data. Collecting the data was a big task. We have 300,000 observations.
That you have can collection, and that caught me in my extension, that you had some part of job that you collected
Yes. So
some of the dates.
yeah. So these forms. So these forms are publicly accessible. So you can use computers to pull out this data. But part of the hard part is cleaning the data. So if you've worked with data, the forms are pretty consistent, but there was still a lot of data cleaning that had to happen. We also did a lot of hand collection on the companies that disclosed their insider trading policies. But yeah, it was definitely a lot of work to put the thing together. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Professor,
All right. Yeah.
I think now it's important. Do you think a possible more trading side in the second quality the last quarter?
Say that again.
Inside the trading.
Yep.
More is last quarterly or, for example, second quarterly?
I mean,
That's the quarter or the second quarter?
oh, when do executives trade?
Is possible?
In different quarters, it's more common in a quarter specific.
Some quarters. Yes. Well, so for a lot of executives, so there's a lot of reasons why executives trade. So some of them trade when they have real life purchases to make. They want to buy a house. If they want to buy a boat, if they're, if they've got, some, elderly parent that they're trying to do. So some of the trading is for that. It's also the case that when I give an executive, say, stock, they can't trade it immediately. There's usually a vesting period. So when if I give you stock as an executive, I might tell you you have to wait 2 years or 3 years before you can sell it. And what that means is that if I give you the stock today, it's April 16th, 2024, and if it vests on April 16th, 2027, when that vests, now you're going to have some stock that you can sell. And so empirically what we find is that after these vesting dates, that we see more selling. So for some companies, they might tell you that it vests so much per quarter. Some firms might say it invests so much each year. So these vesting periods tend to drive a lot of the trading as well. And the other thing is prices. We know empirically when the stock price is going up, that executives trade more. And it's not surprising because we typically think of people trying to diversify their portfolio. And if I have 70% of my wealth tied up in my stock, and if the stock price doubles, now I have even more of my wealth tied up in stock. So when the stock price rises, executives will tend to trade for normal rebalancing, diversification, the same way you or I would. If we wanted half our money in stocks and half our money in bonds, and the stock market doubled, well, now we'd have 2/3 of our money in stocks, and we'd sell some stock to rebalance again. And executives do the same thing.
Só para discussão da remuneração, da divulgação, o conselho que regulamenta a questão dos executivos que representa, ele conseguiu judicialmente bloquear a divulgação das empresas dessa remuneração. Eles dizem que executivos de empresas eles não são agentes públicos e teria que ter essa informação divulgada. Assim, pela legislação, as empresas não podem divulgar a remuneração individual de cada um dos executivos. Que foi uma discussão nos tribunais, assim.
Tem uma lei.
Tem uma discussão que o Instituto Brasileiro dos Executivos de Finanças, eles entraram com uma ação no Tribunal Superiores discutindo o regulamento da CVM, da divulgação individual dessa remuneração. E o juiz concedeu favorável a eles, porque eles não são agentes públicos.
Okay. There is a legal issue about the disclosure of the compensation planning
Okay.
for executives in Brazil.
And what's the legal issue?
The executives don't want to disclosure.
That's why you need a regulator. The executives in the U.S. don't want to disclose either, but they have to.
That's a legal question here about this issue now.
Is there a regulator like the SEC in Brazil?
Yeah, CVM.
But they don't have. Do they have power?
No, apparently not.
I don't enforcement.
No enforcement. Well, that's a big deal, right? I mean, we all know the SEC, probably across the world, the SEC, they have a big stick, and they can hit companies really. They can put people in jail. They can, yeah.
Oh, you have a
Yes, I believe one thing that we should keep in mind that might explain the Brazilian case as opposed to the American case would be the fact that Brazil, unlike the United States, is a mixed market economy with a large state presence in its companies, which would lead also these same people to be very close to the state, who would also not want the information and compensation plans to be disclosed. Because I think a lot of the times, I think in the Brazilian case, is very much the touchy subject of the fact that a lot of the businesses are recently privatized, but still have a large influence of the state, which is sort of an impediment to the disclosure.
So people would see them, regular people would see those disclosures and they think that the executives are making too much money or something like that? Is that the...
This is our point.
Because they're government officials as well, to some point. So that might lead to some sensitivity on the issue as to why there's no driving force between disclosure. But I'm not Brazilian, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I mean, in the US, a big driving force is that the shareholders want that information because they want to make sure that the executives are properly compensated and incentivized. But yeah, you're right. I mean, if the government is a big investor, I mean, we were talking at lunch that apparently quite a few Brazilian companies are fairly closely held as well. So if they're closely held and the government is involved, then presumably those people are monitoring what's going on in the firm. But at the same time, if I was a small investor, I'm not sure how much confidence I would have in what was going on, given that some of the investors know what's going on and other investors don't know what's going on. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. All right,
Same question.
Yes.
one more. Yeah.
We, of course, science has value in and of itself. But my question is, if I were an investor, how could I use your study to maximize the return on the stock market privately?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, this paper's not really to. It's not really to guide investors on how to make investments. It's trying to understand how companies manage themselves. So, people that might be interested in this study would, investors might be interested in it, but boards of directors might be interested in it. So if you're on a board of directors and you're trying to think about how to set the insider trading policy. A study like this could tell you what kind of factors to consider and how to think about it. We as academics can learn something about this and teach our students more about how these companies are managed. So if you're teaching students about compensation or governance to better understand it. I mean, toward the end, we do have, some evidence that there are abnormal returns you can earn from investing in these blackout trading windows. But yeah, I mean, the point here is to try to understand how the world works. Trying to make companies more efficient in terms of how they're managing things so that they know when they're doing things consistently with other firms and when not, I think is useful as well.
Pessoal, mais alguma questão, pessoal? Quer perguntar sobre o doutorado no Pensilvânia? Pergunta? Quer saber alguma coisa? Bom, eu queria...
All right, thank you for having me.
Let's take a picture all together. Vamos tirar uma foto.
Okay, sure.
Vem aqui, pessoal, vamos tirar uma foto.
That's window first.
Quem vai bater? Quem é o alto? Quem é o vai bater a foto? Vamos todos. All together. Here. Let's go.
Vamos ir aqui embaixo.
Vem, você, vem. Já parou a gente pode. Não sei se tu está transmitindo ainda. Tá. Está transmitindo ainda?
Tá.
Ok. Let's finish the transmission. Ok. Vamos, vem, pessoal, vem para cá.
Talvez alguns ali na frente.
Para cá, outros aqui para frente. Vamos preencher.
Talvez
Vamos preencher aqui atrás. Vamos preencher aqui atrás. Vem mais um passo.
Pode vir, gente.
Vamos preencher aqui atrás, vem aqui atrás, isso, vem. Venho mais. Henrique, vem.
Nós aqui atrás.
Vem aqui. Vem aqui. Não precisa te abaixar.
Não, é que a gente vai esconder atrás, aí quando vem a foto a gente se abaixa um pouquinho.
Isso, vamos aqui, vamos mais. Isso. Vamos aqui. Quem vai bater a foto aí? João Paulo? Vai fazer uma selfie, hein? Vai fazer uma selfie?
Tem que fazer selfie.
Ok.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Agora troca.
Todos preparados?
Todos.
Tá bom. Já fiz algumas 20.
Algumas 20 foi ótimo.
Vai lá, vem. Vai, João, tira uma selfie.
Tirar a selfie. A luz está mesmo na minha
João
cara.
sempre aparece em maior dimensão, como só tem nada assim.
Pega no Petri agora.
Tira a foto do
Levanta
Petri.
pro Petri. Ó, professor!
Ele está trabalhando lá. Pessoal, obrigado a todos. Vamos encerrar aqui a nossa transmissão também. Nosso agradecimento ao professor Wayne. Thank you, Professor Wayne.
You're welcome.
You're
Yes.
welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Obrigado, pessoal. Boa tarde a todos.
Eu morava todo dia.
Eu acho que tem muito. Eu acho.